There are people who don't realize they've chosen a life without love until years later, when everything looks correct, but nothing feels alive. It doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happens quietly, in the background of life, when emotional silence becomes normal, and you stop questioning it, because questioning it feels more dangerous than accepting it. They don't wake up one day and decide to marry without love. It is never that clear. It starts much earlier, in smaller decisions, in moments where feelings are present but not trusted, where logic feels safer than emotion, and where being chosen by life matters more than choosing life itself. Slowly, love stops being something you listen to and becomes something you negotiate with. At some point, life begins to feel like a series of acceptable choices instead of deeply desired ones. A person doesn't ask, "Do I love this?" as much as they ask, "Is this stable?" or "Is this the right timing?" or "Will I regret saying no more than saying yes?" And when fear starts answering more questions than desire, the direction of life changes without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. Later, when marriage happens without love, it doesn't feel like a shock. It feels like continuation. A continuation of decisions made under pressure, under expectation, under emotional exhaustion. At first, nothing feels wrong because humans are incredibly good at adapting. The mind protects peace by normalizing discomfort. What once felt like emotional emptiness slowly becomes normal life. Two people begin building a shared existence, but not necessarily a shared emotional world. They talk, they manage responsibilities, they fulfill roles, and from the outside everything appears functional. But emotional connection is not built on functionality. It is built on presence, curiosity, emotional safety, and a sense of being deeply known. Without that, two people can live in the same space and still feel internally distant. The strange part is how quietly distance grows. It is not an argument that creates separation. It is repetition without emotional depth. Conversation becomes predictable. Affection becomes routine. Silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling heavy. But instead of recognizing it as emotional absence, the mind starts explaining it away. This is what marriage becomes. This is just maturity. Love is not always intense. These explanations don't remove the emptiness, they just make it easier to tolerate. But beneath all these explanations, something remains unresolved. A quiet internal disconnection. Not loud enough to be called suffering, but constant enough to feel like something essential is missing. The person continues living, continues functioning, continues fulfilling responsibilities, but a part of them slowly detaches from emotional engagement. They stop checking what they feel, because what they feel does not match what they chose. To understand this, you have to go back to where emotional trust was first shaped. Many people who end up in loveless marriages were not taught to follow emotional truth. They were taught to manage emotions, to stay composed, to be practical, to avoid conflict, to prioritize acceptance over authenticity. In such environments, emotional needs are often not explored deeply. They are adjusted, controlled, or postponed. Over time, a belief forms quietly in the background of the mind. Feelings are unreliable, but stability is safe. So when adulthood arrives, this belief continues operating silently. Emotional attraction becomes less important than predictability. Desire becomes less important than approval, and love becomes something that is assumed to develop later, rather than something that must be felt now. This is how people end up saying yes to relationships they do not emotionally feel aligned with. Not because they are careless, but because they are tired of uncertainty. Because uncertainty feels worse than emotional emptiness. And because emotional emptiness, when it arrives slowly, is easy to ignore. After marriage, the structure of life stabilizes, but emotional life does not necessarily follow. There can be shared routines, shared responsibilities, shared conversations, even shared laughter, but still a lack of emotional depth. And over time, this creates a very specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being emotionally unseen while being physically present with someone. In many cases, neither person fully understands what is missing. They only feel it as distance, as fatigue in connection, as a quiet sense of something not clicking. And because there is no obvious conflict, there is no obvious explanation. So both people continue adjusting, lowering emotional expectations without consciously realizing they are doing it. This is where emotional survival takes over. The mind tries to protect stability by reducing emotional demand. If connection is not deeply felt, then expectation is lowered. If emotional fulfillment is not present, then focus shifts to responsibility. Slowly, the relationship becomes more about managing life together than experiencing emotional closeness. But the human nervous system does not forget emotional absence. Even when everything appears stable, something inside starts shrinking. Emotional sensitivity dulls. Joy feels less spontaneous. Presence feels more mechanical. Life continues, but it feels less experienced and more observed, like watching yourself live instead of actually living. And then, at some point, usually without warning, a realization appears. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it comes during a quiet moment, a routine evening, or a simple observation of emotional emptiness that suddenly becomes undeniable. A thought emerges that feels both uncomfortable and clear. I am not emotionally where I thought I would be. This realization does not mean everything is wrong. It means something was never fully examined. It brings awareness to the gap between stability and emotional truth, and that gap is where most silent dissatisfaction lives. Because many people assume love will either exist or not exist, but in reality, love is often replaced by adaptation, by acceptance, by compromise that slowly turns into emotional resignation. And when resignation lasts long enough, it starts to feel like personality instead of a condition. But understanding this does something important. It interrupts unconscious repetition. It brings awareness to the fact that emotional choices were shaped by fear, conditioning, and survival patterns, rather than pure desire. And once a person sees that clearly, they can no longer pretend they are unaware. And awareness, even when uncomfortable, is not punishment. It is the first moment of emotional honesty. It allows a person to stop confusing stability with fulfillment. It allows them to recognize that feeling nothing deeply in a relationship is not something to ignore, but something to understand. From there, something subtle begins to change. The person starts noticing their emotional responses again. They begin to differentiate between what feels safe and what feels alive. They start questioning not just the relationship, but their own emotional patterns. Not in a destructive way, but in a clarifying way. Because the real shift is not always about leaving or staying. It is about becoming honest enough to see what is actually happening inside. To admit what was ignored, to acknowledge what was suppressed, to understand what was chosen out of fear rather than desire. And in that understanding, something softens. Not everything becomes easy, but everything becomes clearer. And clarity, even when painful, is what finally brings a person back into contact with themselves.